A premonition or two might be ruled out right away." Silently, she turned on the little radio. Automatically, he set it for the lowest volume they could hear distinctly. The main item in the news was a baldly factual but toned-down report of the thing from the lake which had left the park and examined a small human town in detail, and then had returned to the park. There were reports of peculiar hoof-prints found where the invaders had been. They were not the hoof-prints of any earthly animal. There was an optimistic report from the scientists at work on the problem of the beam. Someone had come up with an idea and some calculations which seemed to promise that the beam would presently be duplicated. Once it was duplicated, of course, a way to neutralize it could be found. Lockley grunted. The broadcast was enthusiastic in its comments on the scientists. It talked gobbledygook, which sounded as if it meant something but was actually nonsense. It barely touched on the fact that human beings were now ordered out of a much larger space than had been evacuated before. There was a statement from an important official that panic buying of food was both unnecessary and unwise. Lockley grunted again when the newscast ended. "The idea that anything that can be duplicated can be cancelled," he announced gloomily, "is unfortunately rot. We can duplicate sounds, but there's no way to make them cancel out. Not accurately." Jill had eaten a substantial part of the porcupine while the newscast was on. It was not a satisfying breakfast, but it cheered her immensely after 2 days of near starvation. "But," she observed, "maybe that won't apply to this business when you report what you know. It's not likely that anybody else has stood just outside a beam and made tests of what it's like and how it's aimed and so on." They started off. For journeying in the park, Lockley had the advantage that as part of the preparation for making a new map, he'd familiarized himself with all the mapping done to date. He knew very nearly where he was. He knew within a close margin just where the terror beam stretched. He'd smashed his watch, which during sunshine substituted admirably for a compass, but he could maintain a reasonably straight line toward that part of the park's border the terror beam would cross. They moved doggedly over mountain flanks and up valleys, and once they followed a winding hollow for a long way because it led toward their destination without demanding that they climb. It was in this area that, pushing through brushwood beside a running stream, they came abruptly upon a big brown bear. He was no more than 100 feet away. He stared at them inquisitively, raising his nose to sniff for their scent. Lockley bent and picked up a stone. He threw it. It clattered on rocks on the ground. The bear made a whuffing sound and moved aggrievedly away. "I'd have been afraid to do that," said Jill. "It was a he-bear," said Lockley. "I wouldn't have tried it on a she-bear with cubs." They went on and on. At mid-morning, Lockley found some mushrooms. They were insipid, and only acute hunger would make them edible raw, but he filled his pockets. A little later there were berries, and as they gathered and ate them, he lectured learnedly on edible wild plants to be found in the wilderness. Jill listened with apparent interest. When they left the berry patch, they swung to the left to avoid a steep climb directly in their way. And suddenly Lockley stopped short. At the same instant Jill caught at his arm. She turned white. They turned and ran. 100 yards back, Lockley slackened his speed. They stopped. After a moment he managed to grin mirthlessly. "A conditioned reflex," he said wryly. "We smell something, and we run. But I think it's the old familiar terror beam that crosses highways to stop men from using them. If it were a portable beam projector with somebody aiming it, we wouldn't be talking about it." Jill panted, partly with relief. "I've thought of something I want to try," said Lockley. "I should have tried it yesterday when I first smashed my watch." He retraced his steps to the spot where they'd caught the first whiff of that disgusting, reptilian jungle decay odor which had bombarded their nostrils. Jill called anxiously, "Be careful." He nodded. He got the coiled bronze watch spring out of his pocket. He went very cautiously to the spot where the smell became noticeable. Standing well back from it, he tossed one end of the spring into it. He drew it back. He repeated the operation. He moved to one side. Again he swung the gold-colored ribbon. He dangled it back and forth. Then he drew back yet again and wrapped his left hand and wrists with many turns of the thin bronze spring, carefully spacing the turns. He moved forward once more. He came back, his expression showing no elation at all. "No good," he said unhappily. "In a way, it works. The spring acts as an aerial and picks up more of the beam than my hand. But I tried to make a Faraday cage. That will stop most electromagnetic radiation, but not this stuff. It goes right through, like electrons through a radio tube grid." He put the spring back in his pocket. "Well," he grimaced, "let's go on again. I had a little bit of hope, but some smarter men than I am haven't got the right gimmick yet." They started off once more, and this time they did not choose a path for easier travel, but went up a steep slope that rose for hundreds of feet to arrive at a crest, with another steep slope going downhill. At the top, Lockley said sourly, "I did discover one thing, if it means anything. The beam leaks at its edges, but it's only leakage. It doesn't diffuse. It's tight. It's more like a searchlight beam than anything else in that way. You can see a light beam at night because dust motes scatter some part of it. But most of the light goes straight on. This stuff does the same. It's hard to imagine a limit to its range." He trudged on downhill. Jill followed him. Presently, when they'd covered 2 miles or more with no lightening of his expression, she said, "You said you understand how it works. Radio and radar beams don't have effects like this. How does this have them?" "It makes high-frequency currents on the surface of anything it hits. High frequency doesn't go into flesh or metal. It travels on the surface only. So when this beam hits a man, it generates high frequency on his skin. That induces counter-currents underneath, and they stimulate all the sensory nerves we've got, of our eyes and ears and noses, as well as our skin. Every nerve reports its own kind of sensation. Run current over your tongue, and you taste. Induce a current in your eyes, and you see flashes of light. So the beam makes all our senses report everything they're capable of reporting, true or not, and we're blinded and deafened. Then the nerves to our muscles report to them that they're to contract, and they do. So we're paralyzed." "And," said Jill, "if there's a way to generate high frequency on a man's skin, there's nothing that can be done?" "Nothing," said Lockley dourly. "Maybe," said Jill, "you can figure out a way to prevent that high-frequency generation." He shrugged. Jill frowned as she followed him. She hadn't forgotten Vale, but she owed some gratitude to Lockley. Womanlike, she tried to pay part of it by urging him to do something he considered impossible. "At least," she suggested, "it can't be a death ray." Lockley looked at her. "You're wrong there," he said coldly. "It can." Jill frowned again, not because of his statement, but because she hadn't succeeded in diverting his mind from gloomy things. She had reason enough for sadness herself. If she spoke of it, Lockley would try to encourage her. But he was concerned with more than his own emotions. Without really knowing it, Jill had come to feel a great confidence in Lockley. It had been reassuring that he could find food, and perhaps more reassuring that he could chase away a bear. Such talents were not logical reasons for being confident that he could solve the alien's seemingly invincible weapon, but she was inclined to feel so. And if she could encourage him to cope with the monsters, why, it would be even a